J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is a book that I loved for a long time. I, like many people who loved the book, was very skeptical when Peter Jackson was announced as the director of the Lord of the Rings movies in the 1990s. But within the first 5 minutes of the first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, which came out in December of 2001, I was completely pulled in to Peter Jackson's vision of the Lord of the Rings. What I'd like to do today is to talk to you some about the themes that Peter Jackson's movie opened up for me about the novel, sometimes because of things the movie did very well, other times because of things I thought the movie had to leave behind that I discovered in the novel itself. I think that The Lord of the Rings is a deeply Catholic novel, but it's not Catholic because it's a catechism or because it's a theology. It's Catholic because it has a deeply sacramental view of the nature of the human world and of human action in it, because it has a view of language that's deeply analogical, that sees the power of language to raise us above our everyday lives into something transcendent and more deeply meaningful than we could ever have just with an earthly life. And finally, because Tolkien's novel thinks through pictures, through icons, that themselves have a richness that goes beyond what any description in discursive language can give us. It's difficult for a movie to do all these things in the same way a novel can, but a movie does have some resources that a novel does not have. Resources, for example, of a particular visual vocabulary, and, of course, of the music. So, I will be thinking primarily about Tolkien. I'm more in love with him than I am with Peter Jackson, but I am very grateful for Peter Jackson's movies. And so even though I started as a skeptic, I think Peter Jackson helped me to rediscover the richness of Tolkien's novel in a way that I hadn't seen it before. Let me start out by reading a particular passage to you from something that was always very famous in the novel and then became probably the most famous scene in all three of the movies, the scene called the Mirror of Galadriel. So, the company that is trying to take the Ring of Power to Mount Doom to destroy it has had a disaster in the way that they've gone through the mines of Moria when Gandalf fell to Balrog. After they escape from the mines, they enter the enchanted wood of Lothlorien, where the elf queen Galadriel reigns, along with her husband, Celeborn. As they prepare to leave, Frodo and Sam are thinking about their experience of being in this elf realm. I think that Tolkien's way of conceiving the way that the elves live and how that mode of life is perilous, one of his favorite words, perilous for human beings, and yet can also be salvific for human beings. I believe this is one of the central themes of the novel. Now, the passage called the Mirror of Galadriel, if you remember from the first movie, from The Fellowship of the Ring, Peter Jackson presents us with a Galadriel who my students always call Scary Galadriel, because she transforms into a kind of power-hungry witch in a vision of what she would be if she had the Ring of Power. Let's take a look at what happens in the novel. First of all, if you can remember the scene from the movie, Frodo and Sam are not both in this scene. Only Frodo is. The scene also happens deep into the night, probably at midnight, a typical symbolic time of day. That's not at all the way that Tolkien set up this scene. Here's how this scene begins. One evening, Frodo and Sam were walking together in the cool twilight. It's crucial for Tolkien that this moment of the Mirror of Galadriel happens at twilight, that is, at the moment when the stars come out. This is part of the iconic thought of the analogical speech and of the sacramental action that Tolkien invests in The Lord of the Rings. The moment when the stars come out, for the elves, the stars are in the natural world the highest presence of the divine. The first time we really meet the elves in the novel is back in the Woody End in the Shire. And when the hobbits come across the elves, it is twilight, and as the first star comes out, our planet Venus, the elves sing a hymn to Elbereth, their goddess that they also call the Star Kindler. So, from the very beginning of the novel, stars have been associated with something transcendent from this merely earthly life. And the elves have been shown to us as the living beings in Middle-earth, most devoted to that transcendence. Here, Frodo and Sam, within an elf realm, the realm ruled by Galadriel, are experiencing something of the elves' own experience of the way the natural world lifts us into a world of grace and a world of transcendence. And so that's why this scene in the novel is set at twilight. One evening, Frodo and Sam are walking together in the cool twilight. That is also, that line is a reminiscence of a line in Genesis about walking in the cool of the evening. I won't try to go into the biblical resonances right now, but that's another aspect of this novel. Now, think of Peter Jackson instead setting this scene, first of all, by isolating Frodo. He isolates Frodo from Sam and the other hobbits in order to show Frodo as the lonely hero who must bear the burden all on his own, as opposed to Tolkien's vision of Frodo as essentially needing his servant Sam to help him. Within Tolkien's world, Sam's service to his master Frodo elevates Sam and makes Sam's life participate in some of the greatness that Frodo's life participates in. That's an aspect of Tolkien's storytelling that I think you must say is completely lost in Peter Jackson's movies. Peter Jackson instead makes Frodo and Sam's relationship into a kind of buddy movie. Now, this is not a terrible thing. There are aspects of a buddy movie in the novel itself. But it's important that there's a hierarchy within the novel between Frodo and Sam. Frodo is the master, and he is the one who has experience with elves. Sam is the servant who longs for that experience and does grow into some of it within this scene and within the novel as a whole. For Tolkien, a crucial part of the story, of the interest, the dramatic interest about the hobbits, is the way hobbits have a capacity to grow into something that transcends the good but low and earthly life of the Shire. So, already in the first line of this passage, we see an important difference between what Peter Jackson's movie imagines as the core of this particular scene and what Tolkien imagined it as. Peter Jackson imagines this scene as a moment that shows Frodo as the isolated hero who must bear all of the burden. Tolkien sees this scene as another moment that shows how Sam, by being a loyal servant to Frodo, is brought into a higher understanding and a deeper consciousness of the transcendence that the elves represent. So, both the fact that it's at twilight in the novel, which gives you the transcendence of the elves through the principles of the stars, and the fact that both Frodo and Sam are there, so that we get to see Sam's education into transcendence, those are crucial for Tolkien's scene. They're both eliminated from Peter Jackson's scene. It's very difficult for Peter Jackson in his storytelling in a movie to build in these particular elements that are so deep a part of Tolkien's own imagination. Now, let me go on with this Mirror of Galadriel passage. Frodo and Sam are then met by the Lady Galadriel, but only after Sam has said that he would like an opportunity to see some real magic at work. Frodo does not want to see magic, but Sam does. Sam thinks of the elves in what I'm tempted to call superstitious terms, as if the elves all have this powerful magic that they can do for display or for glory, to show off. And you can see why Sam would want some of that. He's been in love with the old tales of the elves since he was a little tiny boy, and he always was asking Bilbo to tell him more and teach him more. He had a natural openness to transcendence, but that natural openness had mixed into it a bit of an innocent superstition. And so he wants transcendence to become a form of earthly power in the form of magic. So Sam says to Frodo, "Oh, I wish I could see some magic before we go. I bet the Lady Galadriel, she could do some great magic." Well, Frodo understands elves better than that. He knows that the things that seem magical about the elves have more to do with the fact that the elves have before their minds always present the fact that this world for them is an exile from the true world, the world of their immortal home, dwelling with the gods. Now, I won't try to go into that more right now. It's a long topic, what the nature of the elves as exiles in Middle-earth really means within the world of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It's a topic that rewards a lot of reflection. I think it was a topic on which Tolkien himself was rather torn. But let's go back to Frodo and Sam then. So, right after Sam expresses a desire to see some magic, lo and behold, along comes the Lady Galadriel and offers him a chance to see it with her prophetic mirror. The Mirror of Galadriel is a divination device. By looking into it, you can learn things that you don't learn simply by seeing things or simply by ordinary experience of the world. But the price of that visionary experience is that you can't control it. If you want vision of things that are transcendent, you have to give up your normal standards of earthly control. So, the Lady Galadriel warns both Sam and Frodo, this mirror is not useful for giving you counsel. It is useful for giving you vision. And that distinction between counsel and vision is absolutely crucial for this scene in the novel. Lady Galadriel repeats a number of times in the novel that she is not a counselor. She refuses to give counsel. That is, she won't be put to the use of giving you ways to make your plans come true. Right? Lady Galadriel won't play the role of the kind of preacher who tells you that if you pray to Jesus, you'll get rich. That isn't the way that the transcendent value of human life enters into earthly life. So, Sam and Frodo decide that they will look into the mirror. Sam first, because he's so eager for magic. But Sam says a very curious thing. He tells the lady, yes, if you're willing to let me, I want to look into the mirror. And then he turns to Frodo in an aside and he says, and I'd not mind a glimpse of what's going on at home. Sam very much wants to know what's going on back in the Shire. And he goes on and says, it seems a terrible long time that I've been away. But there, like as not, I'll only see the stars or something that I won't understand. I'll only see the stars or something that I won't understand. That is, Sam thinks, maybe I'll just see something absolutely every day, like stars. Or maybe I'll even see something I don't understand. Sam claims to understand the stars. It's no wonder then that in the immediate sequel, what happens is Lady Galadriel says, like as not, with a gentle laugh. Sam thinks he understands the stars. He has no idea that the stars are the way that divinity reveals itself in this world to the elves and to those who would learn from the elves. Part of Sam's education by the end of the novel will be that he will understand much more what it means that even for a Shire resident, somebody like a hobbit, even from somebody whose life is everyday good but low, not a piece of high culture or great education, even for us, the stars are a way to lift our minds and hearts toward the things of greater glory and more importance in the scheme of the entire world. The entire world is not just the earth. The heavens are a part of that world, and the stars give us a kind of meditative access to it. So when Sam says, I'll probably only see the stars or something I won't understand, what Sam doesn't realize is how ironic that statement is. But of course the Lady Galadriel does realize it, and that's why she laughs a gentle laugh. She constantly laughs throughout this whole scene. Think your mind back to Peter Jackson's scary Galadriel. In Peter Jackson's version of this scene, Galadriel throughout is in deadly serious earnest. She certainly has no lilt in her voice or any laugh on her lips. She doesn't look like she's ever laughed her entire 1,000 years of life. Peter Jackson has to make Lady Galadriel much tougher and scarier because he doesn't have the story about Sam growing into an appreciation of transcendence, about Sam, so to speak, becoming more elf-like through his experience with the elves. For him, Sam is just a buddy. But he doesn't even give the experience to Sam. He gives it to Frodo, as if it's Frodo who had something to learn from Galadriel. True enough, Frodo does have something to learn from Galadriel, but nothing like as much as Sam has to learn. So, the novel gives us a wonderful occasion of Sam's spiritual education in a way that the movie can't give us at all, by trying to isolate Frodo to show us how hard it is to be a lonely hero, a rather stock-in-trade notion of the hero after all. By doing that, Peter Jackson takes away from us Tolkien's much more interesting point about our education into transcendence. We, after all, are the people who identify with Sam. We think we might just see the stars or something we don't understand as well. So, the movie takes away from us one of the most important possibilities for identification. That identification the novel gives us with Sam's own education and growth. Now, when Sam looks into the mirror, he sees a vision, a back home of the Shire of trees being cut down. And he's horrified. This is part of the feature of Tolkien's novel that made The Lord of the Rings a great cult novel for the early environmentalist movement of the late 50s and the 1960s. The notion that seeing trees being cut down in your home in the Shire might be the way that evil comes home to you. The kind of people who would wantonly cut down beautiful trees are the kind of people who represent the evil of Mordor, an evil that has no real point, an evil that thinks of itself as powerful exactly when it makes the world smaller and less beautiful. When Sam then has this vision, the first thing he wants to do is run back home and save the trees, and to save also his father and the other people he loves who are being exposed to this kind of industrialized evil back in the Shire. But of course he can't leave. He can't give up being the servant to Frodo. The task of Sam's spiritual enlightenment is not yet over. He cannot abandon that task any more than he can abandon this man he loves, his master Frodo. So, Tolkien, by working us through Sam, helps us to think of our own trials within some sort of path of spiritual growth. Spiritual growth never is without pain and never is without peril. All of The Lord of the Rings makes that thought available to us. it never gives us a false pleasure or a false ease about what the path of spiritual growth will bring to us. Now, when Frodo looks into the mirror, he has a much more terrifying vision. He has a vision of many things he doesn't understand, but that show him to have a place in a much longer history that involves the ring and the elves. But at the very end of his vision, he has a vision of the eye of Sauron, the Dark Lord, looking for him. In the movie, Sam's vision of the trees being cut down and the Shire being destroyed by industrialization is in fact transferred to Frodo. And the vision of the eye is made much more pessimistic in the movie. The eye is seeing Frodo. In the book, the eye can't yet see him because he's hidden by the strength of Lothlorien. So the movie makes Sauron basically victorious already, as if Sauron can already see through the Elven Realm of Lothlorien. This is a huge change in the plot line, but of course, Peter Jackson didn't expect moviegoers to experience that scene as the end of the movie. He had 2 more movies to make. But in a way, what Peter Jackson has done visually with the eye in that scene shows that the eye has already broken through all of the defenses that the elves have. In the novel, the eye is looking, trying to find Frodo, but cannot find it. And Galadriel comments on that. And it's part of the deep hope that Frodo's able to have, that ultimately, against all the odds, they may still be victorious. To my mind, one of the most striking things here, then, is that a vision that showed how Sam still has a lot of spiritual growth to undergo because he's so rooted in the Shire, in the movie is transferred to Frodo. And Frodo's vision of the eye is made much more despairing in the movie than it is in the novel. To move the story along, Peter Jackson feels he has to both collapse plot elements and intensify them so that the experience is more frightening. This scene is capped then by yet one more example of Peter Jackson simplifying and pressing together aspects of the plot that are important to Tolkien, and of trying to provide an intensification of our experience of fear in that moment. After Frodo has had his vision, and he has a conversation with Galadriel, Frodo offers to give the ring to the Elf Queen. He thinks, Galadriel, you will do a better job of completing this task than I, a little hobbit, can do. In the movie, you'll remember that Galadriel starts almost robot-like, like she's being drawn by a powerful magnet, walking toward Frodo. And her voice gets an octave lower, and suddenly she's transformed into some sort of sea demon. And we see her transformation as her giving into the temptation to take the ring. Ultimately, she comes out of that transfiguration and breathes a sigh of relief and says, oh, I've resisted the temptation, I'm going to be okay. Peter Jackson wanted the ring to be shown as something nobody could resist. That's why he ran that scene that way. But what does it miss about the Lady Galadriel? Well, here's how Tolkien wrote that scene. Frodo says to her, "You are wise and fearless and fair, Lady Galadriel. I will give you the one ring if you ask for it. It is too great a matter for me." And here's what Tolkien says. Galadriel laughed with a sudden clear laugh. Nobody could imagine Peter Jackson's Galadriel laughing. That's why she's scary Galadriel. But Tolkien's Galadriel is characterized in this whole scene primarily by her laughter. Remember her gentle laugh when Sam said he'd probably only see the stars. She laughs now when Frodo offers the ring. She does give the little speech that Peter Jackson also has her give about how the ring would transform her. And instead of a dark lord, you will set up a queen. But at the end of that, here is what she does. She let her hand fall, and the light faded, and suddenly she laughed again. And lo, she was shrunken, a slender elf woman clad in simple white, whose gentle voice was soft and sad. I passed the test, she said. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. She doesn't say that as if she'd finally torn herself away from a terrible temptation. She laughs. Galadriel can now laugh about what this temptation is. That doesn't mean she didn't experience it as a temptation. It means that in the novel, the Lady Galadriel has within her resources of mirth, another favorite word of Tolkien's, one that he applies to Gandalf repeatedly after Gandalf returns as Gandalf the White. The mirth, both of Gandalf and of the Lady Galadriel, is a central way that the novel presents them as having a resource for resisting evil that is always underappreciated by those who are evil themselves. In Tolkien's way of seeing things, bad guys don't laugh. One of the features of evil is that it's humorless. Because part of the experience of humor and laughter is an ability not to take yourself so seriously. The Lady Galadriel can laugh because she doesn't think she's the whole story. Sauron could never laugh at himself. It'd be impossible when you're so self-absorbed to be able to stand far enough away from yourself to see yourself as something worthy of laughter. So, we take away one of the main characteristics of the Lady Galadriel in Tolkien's imagination of this scene. Now, think about this scene. This surely is one of the scenes where, in some ways, the movie is closest to the book. A lot of the language is taken over directly, and anybody who saw that movie when it first came out immediately thought, oh, this is a perfect version of the Mirror of Galadriel. It was only after the movie that I went back and reread The Lord of the Rings and was astonished to find how much my own memory of the book had been captured by the movie instead. And so, the aspect of Frodo as an isolated hero, bearing a lonely burden, a rather stock piece of hero movies, the exact opposite of Tolkien's view. The contrast between Frodo's openness to what the elves represent, their transcendence and their respect for divinity, and Sam's growth toward that appreciation, but without him yet having accomplished it. His life is still rooted in and in a way limited by the Shire, in a way that Frodo's is not. That aspect of the scene disappears. And finally, the image of Galadriel is essentially different. It's not a small difference to take her laughter away from her. It changes everything about who she is and what she represents. Now, from what I've just said about the difference between this scene and the movie, a great movie scene, right? I don't want to underestimate it. It is a great piece of movie making. But from everything I've said about this scene in the movie and its differences from the book, you might think, oh, well, he must think the movies are a failure. That's completely wrong. I don't mean that at all. The movies tell a different story from the story that's in the book. It's unreal to think the movies could have told exactly the same story. The movies have different resources to tell a story. One of the resources they don't have is time. the movies could not possibly include everything that's included in the book. They would still be being made, I suppose. So, Peter Jackson had to make some hard choices about how to make a plot move. All the way back to Aristotle's Poetics, we've known that the core of drama is plot. Peter Jackson had to have a plot. Tolkien in his novel has a great luxury compared to the director of a movie, even 3 long movies like Peter Jackson. That luxury is your leisure as a reader. But of course, if you don't use your leisure to read the details of the novel, if you let your memory remain controlled by Peter Jackson's movies, well, then the resources that Tolkien expected in his readers, the resources that makes leisure the basis of culture, those resources disappear, and all you can see are the things that the movie can give to you. So, the Mirror of Galadriel, for me, is a way of really getting inside the question of how will I'm tempted to say, protect my experience of the novel, The Lord of the Rings, from the great artistic power of Peter Jackson's movies of The Lord of the Rings. Rereading these passages and looking for their thematic details in Tolkien's imagination is a way to retrieve it from Peter Jackson's imagination, which flattens out Tolkien's world, so that all of the issues about spiritual growth, about what the elves represent, and about Frodo's sacrifice for those transcendent values, those features tend to fall away from the movies, and yet remain very prominent in any active rereading of the novel. Now, let me say a little bit, though, about what makes the movie so great. Great, not just as a neat movie to see, but great as an attempt to think its way into Tolkien's own mind. 2 things the movie has that the book can't have: the visual power, the images, and the music. Let me start with the visual power. Tolkien himself was a very visual writer. He was something of an accomplished amateur artist as well, but Tolkien could not produce visual power as art in anything like the way he could produce literary power. But there are many passages that just jump out at you as almost like a painting. Let me take a look at a passage where this is especially striking, and it is really a major theme of the experience of the elf realm. This is when the company is entering Lothlorien. Those of you who know the story will remember that the company all had to be blindfolded when they were entering Lothlorien, the Elven Realm. And that's because the elves didn't trust a dwarf, Gimli. But later on, Galadriel and Celeborn send a message that they can all have their blindfolds taken off, and so they can walk through the woods and really see it. So Tolkien has set up a moment of sudden vision. Here's what happens. When Frodo's eyes were uncovered, Frodo looked up and caught his breath. They were standing in an open space. To the left stood a great mound covered with a sward of grass as green as springtime in the elder days. Upon it, as a double crown, grew 2 circles of trees. The outer had bark of snowy white and were leafless but beautiful in their shapely nakedness. The inner were malorn trees of great height, still arrayed in pale gold. High amid the branches of a towering tree that stood in the center of all, there gleamed a white flet. At the feet of the trees and all about the green hillsides, the grass was studded with small golden flowers shaped like stars. Among them, nodding on slender stalks, were other flowers, white and palest green. They glimmered as a mist amid the rich hue of the grass. Over all the sky was blue, and the sun of the afternoon glowed upon the hill and cast long green shadows beneath the trees. Now, that is an example of Tolkien at the height of his painterly powers. He describes Frodo's sudden vision of the Elven Realm with this great vividness, but in a way, great simplicity about the nature of the colors and the forms and how striking they were. He goes on to put it this way. He says, Frodo stood a while lost in wonder. It seemed to him that he had stepped through a high window that looked on a vanished world. Those of you interested in an exercise for the reader, go read John Keats' Odes, and you'll see that Tolkien is drawing on Keats for this image of looking through a window onto a fairy world. A light was upon it for which his language had no name. The image has more in it than the language can give us. Thought is iconic. We have a powerful picture we use language to describe and articulate, but the articulation is never as complete as the image is itself. For which his language had no name. All that he saw was shapely, but the shapes seemed at once clear-cut, as if they had been first conceived and drawn at the uncovering of his eyes, and ancient, as if they had endured forever. This is a particularly beautiful example of something that Tolkien does all the time with the elves. He describes the elves by using two contradictory terms. They're both so gay and so sad. They're both so young and so old. Here, that the shapes of the elven world seemed at once clear-cut, as if they had been first conceived and drawn at the very uncovering of Frodo's eyes, and yet they seemed ancient, as if they had endured forever. Frodo saw no color but those he knew, gold and white and blue and green, but they were fresh and poignant, as if he had at that moment first perceived them and made for them names, new and wonderful. I might add here again, there's clearly a biblical allusion to Adam naming the animals. Naming the things that are new, giving them names, finding a language, however inadequate, is a part of the fact that Frodo is now in a paradise world. No blemish or sickness or deformity could be seen in anything that grew upon the earth. On the land of Lorien, there was no stain. That word stain is one of the keys to a deeper understanding of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The elf realm is an unstained world. It's a world whose visual power is that of perfect freshness, but without any seeking after idiosyncrasy or mere novelty. So everything seems both brand new and extremely ancient. It's Tolkien's way of describing what a painting would be in an idiom that captured transcendence without itself striving just to show off its own powers. What kind of visual art could bring us to that sort of experience? Peter Jackson's movie making at its height tries to give us the experience that in the novel can only be described for Frodo, can only be given inadequate names within the world of the novel. But on the world of the screen, it can be given to us whole as a visual experience in which we are completely immersed. Peter Jackson hired two conceptual designers to get the look of the movie who understood this very deeply. And what they did was to move to the style of art that's known as Pre-Raphaelite art from the middle of the 1800s, a style that grew up in England as a new kind of religious art, of specifically Christian religious art. Indeed, it was often criticized within Protestant England exactly for being too Catholic in its religious sensibilities. That was the visual idiom that Peter Jackson moved to in order to express the wonder and beauty, the combination of freshness and ancientness that makes for elfin transcendence within the Lord of the Rings. So, as much as I've criticized some of the things that are missing from the Lady of Galadriel seen in the movie that are present in the book, some of these are retrieved with the visual vocabulary. Even if they disappear in plot or in speech, they reappear in the way we're immersed into the visual beauty of the movie. And those of us who realized, because we listened to the commentary tracks on the extended versions of the movies, that the conceptual designers intentionally went to a pre-Raphaelite visual vocabulary to capture this transcendence. Once we realize that, we're in a position to appreciate something about Peter Jackson's accomplishment that we would never notice if all we did was analyze plot. A movie needs to have a plot, but a movie is not reducible to a plot. So the visual vocabulary has given us something very precious and very worthwhile. Something also that goes deep down into the roots, I believe, of Tolkien's own imagination. In many ways, J.R.R. Tolkien was a man of the 19th century. He grew up with sensibilities formed by the religious and aesthetic, artistic movements that arose in England in the middle of the 1800s. And appreciating that is something that Peter Jackson's movie helped me with and has enriched my ability then to read Tolkien's own novel. Let me say one quick word about the music. Howard Shore, the composer of this music, naturally enough, won an Academy Award for it. The music throughout the Lord of the Rings movies is quite extraordinary. Where did it come from? Well, movie music of the sort that Howard Shore wrote, that is, classical music made for big epic movies, all of it owes its existence and its conception to Richard Wagner's operas. Wagner, the great artistic figure of the second half of the 1800s. Now, it's obvious that there are all sorts of important connections between Wagner's great four-opera series called The Ring of the Nibelung and Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I can't right now go into all of these connections, but they're very worth exploring. All I want to point out right now is that as in the visual vocabulary, Peter Jackson allowed the artists working with him to draw on 19th century aesthetic ideals that Tolkien himself would have known about. Peter Jackson also got the right composer, Howard Shore, who wrote a thoroughly Wagnerian soundtrack for the Lord of the Rings movies. So that the music of the Lord of the Rings raises them to the musical level of some of Wagner's own work. I don't say Howard Shore wrote music as great as the music that Wagner wrote, but Howard Shore wrote very fine music in a genre, a tradition of music that Wagner is the founder of. So once again, the music elevates our experience of the plot and the action, just as the visual vocabulary elevates it. When Frodo uncovered his eyes from the blindfold, he responded with wonder and delight, and also a kind of awe. I think these movies of Peter Jackson, as far as the visual vocabulary and the musical vocabulary that he deployed, they help us to experience that immersion in an experience of wonder, delight, and awe. Peter Jackson makes of the heroes on the screen in the Lord of the Rings movies creatures of light and music. And for that, we have much to be grateful. So, when we start from the Mirror of Galadriel and we focus only on plot, all we can see is the superiority of Tolkien's book to Peter Jackson's movies. But if we let the movies work on us the way movies do, if we're fair and open to all that movies do, I believe that Peter Jackson recuperated at least some of that diminishment at the level of plot and action within what he could do with the visual spectacle of the movies and the musical underpinnings of our experience of the movies. You should still read the book and free your memory from Peter Jackson's diminishment of the plot, but you should see the movies too.